All right, Numbers 20, let's call this one Happy Tears. And it's probably going to take me a while to get to the explanation of the title. But this is a chapter that's relatively sad, thus the tears part. But ultimately, by the time you get to Matthew chapter 17, it's going to relate to something we talked about in the last chapter from 1 Corinthians 15, where the author asks, death, where is your sting and where is your victory? Matthew 17 is kind of going to be that to this particular chapter, because in this chapter, Moses is going to strike the rock. He's going to be disqualified himself from entering the promised land. There are a number of things to notice. Maybe first of all, I don't think it's a coincidence that all of the things God mentioned in the red heifer sacrifice, a sacrifice for being defiled by death, comes just before Numbers 20. Why? Because early on, Moses is going to lose his sister Miriam. And even though they didn't always get along, we saw in Numbers chapter 12 how she criticized his choice of wife. I have to believe, understanding that Moses was described as the meekest man in the world. And before we even get out of Numbers chapter 12, where she had actually betrayed him, he was still praying for her healing. I have to believe that he wanted to grieve here. But he didn't really get an opportunity to grieve, because soon after she dies, the next set of verses is going to say that people start to complain again. And it's one of the second things to maybe notice in life. To the degree we are living under, on the downside of a double standard, it can be hard to accept. But understand that over and over in the Word, we see it's the way in which God builds his people. His own son, we talked about before, was not born into what seems to be the best of births. Why? Because we mentioned when we looked at the sacrifices for cleansing from childbirth back in Leviticus 12, his mother offered up the sacrifice for a woman who really couldn't afford a whole lot. Soon after offering up that sacrifice, he had to enter into refugee status, going to Egypt to flee the death or the murder of the innocents. And so when he came back, and in John, when he's calling his apostles, one of them by the name of Nathanael, told by some of Jesus' early disciples that we think we found the Christ. And they say he comes from Galilee. Nathanael asks, can anything good come from Galilee? So it seems that Christ in his own upbringing had to overcome the double standard of a humble birth. And so likewise with Moses, even though he started out in the palace over and over again, we see him dealing with the downside of having to bear up under unfair criticism and having developed the strength of character by now to still be able, as we've seen over and over again, to advocate for the very people who are seeking to harm him. And so in life, when we are dealing with those double standards, understand that it is the way in which he helps us build character. And that is what we're seeing in Moses, because he does not get the benefit of empathy, but he is still required to deal with the people empathetically. And he's still required to understand his relationship to God. And that's what probably gets him in trouble here when he strikes the rock instead of speaking to the rock, as God tells him, in order to bring water for the people who are once again complaining for it. But understand this, as we go forward, we talked about last time, one of my favorite rappers, Bizzle, says, you got to turn your negative into a positive. God is still going to turn what seems to be a very unfair situation for Moses, once again described as the meekest man on earth, finally pushed past his point. It doesn't seem right that he has to lose out on the promised land. But understand, as we've said before, God displays the ways in which he can turn a negative, even one that seems this unfair, into a positive. Because by the time we get to Matthew 17, on the Mount of Transfiguration, we get to see Jesus talking to two people. One is Elijah the prophet, the other is Moses. So even though in the flesh Moses might have missed out on the promised land, our mistakes are not a barrier to God. Understanding that 1 John, the first chapter, in verse 7, reminds us that if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, his blood is constantly cleansing us from all sin. If we're committed genuinely to conforming our ways to his ways, he is willing to cleanse us of every mistake. So even if there are things we have missed out on in this life that we don't feel that we can ever get back, understand those mistakes are not bigger than God. And much like Moses, there is still a promise for those who endure all the drama that life throws at us, which is once again why we often say his best to you as you go forward in him. Hopefully taking advantage of his promise in 1 John chapter 1, that he will constantly cleanse you as you do.